All right, guys. Tonight's notes are entitled Boston, Center of Protest. So we're going to look at the city of Boston and its role leading up to the beginning of the American Revolution. And by the end of today's notes, we will have seen the first shots fired in the American Revolution. So we're going to begin by looking at the Boston Massacre. And this is the famous engraving done by Paul Revere of the Boston Massacre. And I have a big picture of this that we'll look at in class tomorrow, hopefully. And you can see we have British soldiers lined up and shooting at unarmed colonists in the streets of Boston. And we're going to look at the actual history of the Boston Massacre, and your response question will relate to it in a little bit. But let's pick up where we left off. So after repealing the Stamp Act, we know that Britain passed new taxes on the colonists. They were called the Townshend Acts, and they related to a lot of goods that colonists might be using. British officials also cracked down on smuggling that was going on in the colonies. And the next thing that happened is the English are going to send a lot more soldiers and officials to the colonies. You could say that these soldiers and officials might be there to protect the colonists from any dangers, but you could also say that the soldiers and officials were there to enforce these new acts. And that's kind of really the mindset that the people of Boston and the soldiers stationed in Boston had. The situation in Boston gets particularly bad between these soldiers and the colonists. And there's several reasons for this. First of all, soldiers competed with the citizens of Boston for jobs. So there's a potential that colonists were having their livelihoods denied by these soldiers. We're also going to have soldiers and citizens both kind of like taunting each other in the streets. They're both behaving childishly, and they're both acting out in ways to really not to do anything other than just make the other side angry. So, for example, the British troops had band practice during church. The two sides would pass each other in the streets and taunt each other, call each other names. They'd throw things at each other. They'd push each other as they walked past them in the streets. So these two sides, the colonists in Boston and the British soldiers stationed there, are really, we've got two groups that are at odds with each other. And one night in 1770, there is a crowd of colonists gathered in the streets of Boston, and they're confronted by a group of soldiers. And the crowd is an angry, borderline mob. They're taunting and throwing objects like clubs and chunks of ice at the soldiers in the streets. The leader of the troops, the British troops that was there, was trying to keep control of the situation, keep his soldiers in line, but accidentally somebody fires a shot. Nobody knows exactly who fired the shot, but one person fires a shot, and then a couple other soldiers fire shots quickly afterwards. And when the dust settles, 5 colonists were dead. The soldiers were eventually put on trial, but for the most part, they were found not guilty of murder. John Adams, who went on to be one of the leaders of the Continental Congress and then the second president of the United States, actually was the defense attorney for the soldiers, and he defended them when they were on trial and helped make sure that they got a fair trial. Because you have to understand, the British soldiers were feeling threatened. They were getting stuff thrown at them. Their lives were in danger. So 2 soldiers were eventually found guilty of manslaughter, not murder, but the rest of the soldiers were found not guilty, largely due to the defense of John Adams. Many other lawyers in Boston were afraid to defend these soldiers because the whole city was up in an uproar over this Boston Massacre, as they called it. And the Sons of Liberty were really the ones behind this. They're calling this the Boston Massacre, and they're using it to inspire anger and action out of people in the other colonies. And this leads us into the Boston Tea Party. And here you can see an engraving of what was supposed to have happened in the Boston Tea Party. It's not quite like this, but this gives you a sense of colonists boarding ships and destroying some tea. So the Boston Tea Party First, you need to know, in 1770, after the Boston Massacre, the Parliament cancels all the taxes on the colonies. They're trying to kind of relieve some of the tension in the colonies, especially in Boston, trying to settle things down. A couple years later, though, in 1773, Parliament passes a new tax called the Tea Act. Not surprisingly, the Tea Act placed taxes on tea, and it also gave the East India Company a monopoly on tea sales to the colonies. The East India Company itself is a huge, gigantic corporation, one of the original monopolies in world history. We don't have a lot of time to go into it on this class, but it's really fascinating if you get a chance to ever look into the East India Company. They're maybe the most important corporation in the history of the world. But they have this monopoly on tea sales to the colonies. And the Sons of Liberty were determined to resist this new tax on tea. So they organized the Tea Party, or the Boston Tea Party. So one night in late 1773, a group of the Sons of Liberty were disguised as Indians. It wasn't like a secret who they were. Everyone knew they were Sons of Liberty. But they dressed up as Indians, and they boarded the tea ships that were in Boston Harbor. And they would take the tea and they dump it into the harbor. And they destroyed 35,000 pounds of tea in this one night. And the company's stockholders, the owners of the East India Company, were furious. They expected the British government would be protecting their property. They expected the British soldiers stationed in Boston to be able to ensure that their property isn't destroyed. It's also important to understand that this East India Company is owned by some of the most powerful people in England, including the king itself, who had a stake in the East India Company. So we're going to see in response to the Boston Tea Party, Britain is going to pass what are called the Intolerable Acts. So here's another engraving by Paul Revere, and you can get a sense that the woman on the ground being held down is representative of the colonists, and she is literally having these acts shoved down her throats by the British government. We're not going to go into detail on this engraving, but these people all represent different things, but just gives you the sense how the colonists viewed these intolerable acts. So Parliament passed these laws to punish Boston for the Tea Party. The punishment was supposed to last until the tea was paid for. That 35,000 pounds of tea needed to be paid off. So what happened? The British Army was put in charge of the city. And since they sent in so many troops, they needed places to house those troops, and they needed to make sure that they're fed. So the citizens of Boston, the colonists, were forced to house and feed the soldiers in what's called quartering. This is where citizens are forced to bring soldiers into the house, give them a place to stay, and make sure that they're fed. Also, as part of the Intolerable Acts, Massachusetts lost the right to govern itself. The royal governor was given pretty much total control over Massachusetts, and town meetings across the colony were banned. And another part of the Intolerable Acts was that the British officials and British soldiers who were accused of crimes in the colonies would be sent back to England for trial. So that's going to be significant when you think about it. If you're a soldier accused of a crime, your trial will be held in England. So you're sent back home away from the colonists, away from the colonies where all of this anger and tension is. And if anybody is going to offer evidence against you, they also have to pay for themselves to travel to England for that trial. So it basically is giving these British officials and these soldiers free rein. There's no real laws that can be, there are no real punishments for them if they do anything that is technically a crime. And the last part of it was that Boston's harbor was closed. This meant that nothing could come into or leave the city. This really hurt businessmen in the city of Boston, and it meant potentially that people might starve, although I don't think that was an actual issue, but it definitely hurt a lot of families, a lot of businesses who couldn't make money because they were dependent upon trade. When we did our merchant game, you guys know the New England merchants or a significant group. And if you can't get access to Boston Harbor, how are they going to be making their living? So, in response to the intolerable acts, the leaders of Boston asked the other colonies to help. If you remember this drawing that was done by Benjamin Franklin, begins to circulate throughout the colonies. And you can see it's join or die. We need to join together, or like this snake, we're going to be chopped up into little bits by the British, and we will all die. But if we join together, we'll be much stronger. And what happens is the First Continental Congress, which meets in Philadelphia. The First Continental Congress was created in response to Boston's call for help. And 55 delegates from 12 colonies are going to meet in Philadelphia to decide how to respond to the intolerable acts. They decided to do the following. First, they were going to boycott English goods. It worked in the past, why not try it again? Second thing they're going to do is they tell the colonies that it's time to start gathering your weapons. It's time to start getting prepared in case violence breaks out. They also send another petition to the king with their grievances, specifically no more taxes unless we are represented in government. And this is this no taxation without representation that we're going to get to a little bit next week. And they also promised to meet again if things did not improve. So how did the English respond? Well, they responded by sending more troops to Boston. And they declared that Massachusetts was in open rebellion. And that leads us to the first battles of the American Revolution, the battles of Lexington and Concord. It's important to understand that in Massachusetts, in the towns, each town has its own trained militia. And these militias had been gathering weapons and ammunition after the First Continental Congress, as they were told to, in preparation for a fight. And the British had found out that, one, colonists had a huge supply of weapons in Concord, Massachusetts, outside of Boston. They also found out that the Sons of Liberty would be meeting in Lexington, a town along the way to Concord. So, in the middle of the night, the British left Boston with a contingent of troops in hopes of capturing those weapons in Concord and the leaders of the Sons of Liberty in Lexington. And along the way, the first fighting of the American Revolution took place, and it happened in Lexington. No one knows which side fired first, whether the colonists fired on the British or the British fired on the colonists, but that first shot of the American Revolution is fired in Lexington, and it's famously known as the shot heard round the world. In Lexington, 8 colonists were killed, and they were quickly scattered by the British troops. And so the British continued their march on to Concord, where they ran into a much larger group of colonists and eventually were turned back. And so the British had to march back to Boston, and along the way, groups of colonists, these militias, were harassing them the whole time. And the British troops suffered many casualties. So lots of injuries, several deaths as a result of these battles at Lexington and then Concord in the march home. There were riders that had been sent out, including Paul Revere, had been sent to warn the colonists. So because they had forewarning, the British weren't able to capture any of the leaders of the Sons of Liberty or the weapons that they hoped to get at Concord. All right. So that leads us into tonight's response question. Now, there's space below in your notes if you're going to be printing at home. If you're going to be printing at school when you get in tomorrow, you can just do this on a separate sheet of paper. What I want you to do is draw a picture that shows a more accurate version of what happened in the Boston Massacre. Above, you see the famous engraving done by Paul Revere. What actually happened in the Boston Massacre? I want you to try and remember, if you need to, refer back to the previous parts of your notes and draw your own version of the events at the Boston Massacre. Make sure you print off your notes before you come to class tomorrow.